Hi angels, and welcome to my channel. In today's video I want to show you one of the new Hourglass palettes that just launched. I got the Evil Eye one. There is one lighter, the dragon one, and one darker, the lotus flower one. Now I really like the packaging from the lotus flower, but the powders inside are too dark for me, so I decided to skip it. And I was thinking about getting the dragon one because I have a light medium skin tone, but one of the finishing powders in the dragon palette looked quite white, and I was afraid that it's going to be too light for me, so I decided to go with the Evil Eye one. Now let me show you the palette. This is how the palette looks like. It's such a pretty palette actually. 5 of the shades are new, and just the finishing powder is a repeat. The finishing powder is in soft light. I like this finishing powder a lot actually. So I'm going to show you the palette on the eyes and on the cheeks, and I'm going to show you some swatches, and at the end I'm going to show you some comparisons. I have 4 palettes from Hourglass from the previous years, and we are going to compare the new palette with these palettes I already have and see if there are any similar shades. So if you are interested, then please keep watching. Now these are the swatches. This is the finishing powder. You're not going to see it on my hand because it's quite similar to my skin tone. This is the highlighter in Rose Gold Strobe Light. This is a blush in Pink Fusion. This is a blush in Oasis Glow. This is a blush in Vibrant Coral, and the bronzer in Natural Bronze, and they swatch beautifully actually. Now the blushes, the vibrant ones, the Pink Fusion and Oasis Glow, are more matte. They are not fully matte because Hourglass powders are never really matte. They have a maybe natural glow to them, and the blush in Oasis Glow has some shimmer in it, and the highlighter is quite shimmery. I think it's a little bit too much for me, and the highlighter I'm going to put on my eyes as eyeshadow, and the bronzer. Now let's get into the demo. I'm going to start with the bronzer, and let me see. Yeah, it is quite cool tone, and it has a little bit of red in it actually. Do you see that? Slightest bit of a red undertone. I'm going to compare this one to the new contour powder from DIOR, because this one is quite cool tone, but the DIOR one doesn't have any red undertone, and we can see which one looks better on the skin, because I really like the DIOR one. And this is how this looks. And the powders are pigmented, so you don't need a lot. What do you think? I think it's actually quite pretty. Because of the red undertone, you can use it as a blush as well, I think. I would use it as a blush, as a bronzy blush. Very pretty. Now because of the red undertone, I'm not sure if it's going to work for everybody, but especially if you have more of a cool tone skin, I think this is going to look very pretty on you, because it's a cool tone bronzer. If you have a very warm complexion, I think this bronzer can look a little bit muddy. Now I have more of a neutral olive undertone, and I think it works for me, but if you have a very warm undertone, I don't think this bronzer is going to work for you actually. And a little bit on the jawline. You can use cool tone bronzers and contour products quite well on the jawline, because I think it looks prettier than bronzers, because bronzer can look a little bit muddy if you contour with them, but this one works beautiful actually. Now I'm going to put the bronzer on the crease as well, and for that I'm going to use an Hourglass blending brush. I think these Hourglass powders are beautiful on the eyes as well, because when especially I don't have a lot of time, I use them as eyeshadow as well. I just take the palette and do my whole face. And on holidays I don't take a lot of eyeshadows with me, and one of these Hourglass palettes are always with me on holidays because they're so handy. You have everything in one palette. This is how it looks. I think it's a beautiful crease shade actually. Now we have 3 blushes. I'm not sure what I want to do. I think I'm going to use the both vibrant blushes on each side of my face. Then I'm going to remove that, and I am going to put the neutral blush in Oasis Glow, this one, on my cheeks for the day. And the highlighter I'm going to use on my eyes and on my cheeks. For the blushes, I'm going to use the Charlotte Tilbury blush brush, and they are quite pigmented, these blushes, so I'm going to tap a little bit on my hand and then apply on my cheeks because I don't want too much pigmentation on my face. Let me see. Yeah, they are quite pigmented, as you see. I'm going to build the color up so you can see it better, but I personally wouldn't wear it too bright and too much. Now this is the shade Pink Fusion, I think it was. Now I'm going to use the Coral blush on the other side. Let me see. Yeah, and these blushes are pigmented, especially on my skin tone. I think if you have a medium or medium dark skin tone, you still can use this palette. Maybe not the finishing powder, but the blushes you can wear actually. They're quite pigmented. So this is how the Coral one looks like. These are the two blushes. This is in Pink Fusion and this is in Vibrant Coral. And I think they look quite pretty actually. You just have to have a very, very light hand if you are more of a light medium skin tone. But I think this color shows up actually on everybody. So just be careful if you are lighter. But the colors are very pretty and they are not very highlighty. They are more of a soft finish. Soft matte maybe finish. Very pretty. Now I'm going to remove that and apply my foundation new, and then I will be right back with the last blush shade. Now I'm going to try on the nude blush in Oasis Glow. It looks very pretty. I am going to swatch this blush next to the new Chanel Cream to Powder blushes in the beige one, Beige Éclatant I think it's called, because this color reminds me of the Chanel blush. And this is how it looks. This is such a pretty shade. Actually, it has quite a pretty glow, but you don't need a lot of it. On the other side, this color is a very neutral, peachy beige shade, I would say, with a gold shift to it, gold shimmer. It's very pretty. I think this is an everyday blush, and it's my favorite blush in this palette. This is a blush in Oasis Glow, and it's such a pretty shade actually, I think. Very pretty, but it has a lot of glow in it, so be careful if you have texture or enlarged pores, because it is going to accentuate texture and large pores, so be careful with that. Now, because I have a lot on, I'm going to use the finishing powder to soften the blush a little bit, just to soften the blush because it's a little bit too much for me. And I really like this finishing powder actually. It's a very pretty shade, and because of its peach undertone, it's a little bit of color correcting. I really like this. Now I'm going to use the highlighter, and I'm a little bit scared of the highlighter because it is quite strong of a highlight. I'm using just a little bit. I'm going to tap the highlighter a little bit on my hand so I don't get too much on my face. And let me see. Yeah, it's a quite beaming highlighter, and it has an rose gold color. Yeah, it's a quite beaming highlighter. The shade is rose gold, like the description. It's a pretty shade actually. I really like this color, but it's a little bit too much for me. So be very light-handed when you are using this highlight, and I wouldn't use this highlight somewhere else on my face, just on my cheeks, because I think a rose gold highlight looks a little bit strange on the nose or somewhere else to highlight. So this is a highlighter I just use on my cheeks and on my eyes. Now I'm going to use this MAC brush in 217 to put the highlight on my eyelids, and we will see how it looks. Yeah, on the eyes you can see that's more of a rose gold color. It's quite a pretty eyeshadow color actually. I don't know why, but I always love highlighter as an eyeshadow because they're so pretty on the eyes. They make your eyes so bright and pretty and elegant. I like that. Now this is the whole look on the eyes and on the face. Let's get into the swatches, and I'm going to start to swatch the Oasis Glow shade with the new Chanel Cream de Powder blush in Beige Éclatant. Now these are the swatches of the Hourglass blush in Oasis Glow and the Chanel blush in Beige Éclatant. And the Chanel blush is much deeper in tone, has no shimmer. The Oasis Glow has a little bit of gold shimmer in it, and the Chanel blush is a little bit more peachy. The Oasis blush is a little bit more, I would say, golden, but they are not that far away from each other. But I prefer the Chanel blush actually. I prefer the finish of the Chanel blush. Now I swatched the contour shade from the DIOR contour palette in Diorama and the bronzer from the Hourglass palette, and the DIOR powder is much more pigmented actually, and it's deeper and more neutral in tone, and the Hourglass one is lighter in pigmentation and actually a little bit warmer, and you can see that it has the slightest bit of a red undertone. The DIOR powder is brown, a cool brown tone, and the Hourglass powder is a neutral reddish leaning brown tone, I think. But both are very pretty and both work as contour shades. I think the Hourglass one works as a contour shade as well, but I think the DIOR powder is better. Now I want to compare the palette from this year to the palettes I already have, and I'm going to start with this one from last year. And I think that this shade might look similar to the coral shade from this year. Let me swatch them. Now these are the swatches. This is the blush from last year's palette, and this is the one from this year's palette, and I think they're quite different actually. The one from the last year's palette is a little bit more red, and the one from this year's palette is a little bit more pinkish. I think they are different enough actually, but they're very pretty, both of them. Quite vibrant. Now I'm going to compare this palette to the one from this year. I think this one is maybe 2 or 3 years old, and these are the palettes side by side. This is a new one, this is the old one, and I think I'm going to swatch this pink shade next to the pink shade of this palette. Now these are the two blushes. This one is the blush from this year's palette, and this one is the blush from the palette 2 or 3 years ago, the one I showed you a second ago. And the blush, the pink blush in the palette from this year is much warmer, and this pink shade is much cooler, but they are both very vibrant as well. Now I'm going to compare the darker shade from this palette. This came out 2 or 3 years ago, like the other one. I'm just comparing the blushes because actually the bronzer from this year's palette is so much cooler in tone. Every other bronzer in the Hourglass palette are quite warm, so I don't swatch them next to each other. Now I'm going to compare the blushes from this palette to the blushes from this year's palette. So these are the swatches, and as you see, this one is a rose shade of the palette 2 or 3 years ago, and this one is a rose shade from this year's palette, and they are quite similar actually. They are almost identical. I don't know if the camera shows it, but they are very similar actually. But the lilac shade is completely different to the blush shades in this year's palette. Now the last palette I have is this one, and this one is so old. I think this might be 5 or 6 years old, and this is actually my favorite Hourglass palette, but the palette is quite different to the one from this year. I'm going to show you. These are the two palettes, and as you see, they are very different. This one is much more muted and much more soft in tone, and this one, the blushes are much brighter, and this palette from this year is much more shimmery. This one is more of a soft, natural palette. And yeah, but the finishing powder is the same. So this finishing powder from this palette is soft light, and that's the same one from this year's palette. I hope the swatches are helpful in the comparisons, but let's get into my final thoughts. And I think this palette is beautiful actually. I like that the bronzer is a more cool tone bronzer because I have a lot of warm tone bronzer from Hourglass, so I really like that. The blushes are maybe a little bit too pigmented for me, but with light hand then they are going to work. So if you are light-handed, it's okay. If you are heavy-handed, then I'm not sure if they are going to work for you. Be careful. The highlighter I wouldn't use as a highlighter because it's quite a beaming highlighter, but I love the highlighter shade as a eyeshadow, so I'm going to use it. It's beautiful actually, and I love the finishing powder, so for me it's a good palette and I would buy it again. But if you are in a low buy or no buy, then I don't think it's a must-have, because as you saw on my previous palettes, I didn't hit pan on any of them. So I don't think if you have a lot of makeup, then you must have this palette actually. But it is a beautiful palette, and if you have the palette, you are going to enjoy it. Now these are my thoughts about the palettes. So if the video is helpful, then please give me a thumbs up, and if you want to see more from me, then please consider subscribing, and I hope I'm going to see you in my next video. Bye!